Madeline Brooks stepped onto the balcony of her Chicago hotel, expecting a quick check-in call from her husband. Instead, Greg's voice came through the phone like a blade. "I'm divorcing you," he said, casually cruel. "Already sold the loft. Renee and I need a fresh start." Madeline froze. The wind bit through her blazer, but it wasn't the cold that rattled her. It was the sheer audacity. Sold our home? Her fingers clenched around the phone. He wasn't just ending their marriage. He was trying to erase her life while she was 2,000 miles away. She swallowed hard, keeping her tone flat. "You sold the loft?" "Yup," Greg replied, laughing. "Renee deserves more than that cramped space." The name hit like a slap. Renee, the yoga instructor Madeline had suspected for months. Still, she gave him nothing. "Got it," she said, then hung up. No drama, no begging. Greg thought he'd blindsided her, thought she'd crumble. But what he didn't know, what he never bothered to ask, was that Madeline had refinanced the loft 6 months ago, and the deed was in her name alone. Back inside the expo, Madeline moved through the crowd like nothing had happened. But inside, gears were already turning. This wasn't heartbreak, it was strategy. She pulled out her phone again and texted her lawyer. "We need to talk. Greg thinks he sold the loft." Then she looked up, adjusted her name tag, and smiled at a passing vendor. Greg wanted war? He'd just started one. But she wasn't the victim in this story, not anymore. The stage lights flicked on in the ballroom. Madeline took a deep breath, stepped into the spotlight, and walked into her next move. Back when they first toured the loft, Madeline had fallen in love with the exposed brick walls and oversized windows that poured sunlight across the floorboards. It was the kind of place that felt alive, raw and full of potential, like their relationship once had. She had scraped together her savings from 2 major commercial design contracts to help buy it, while Greg, ever the charmer, insisted on handling the paperwork. "It's just easier," he'd said with a grin. "I know how these things work." She'd believed him, wanting to trust that he was building a life with her, not plotting his escape. Looking back, the warning signs were always there. Greg had a habit of brushing her off when she brought up shared finances. He'd wave a hand and say, "Relax, Maddie, I've got it handled." When she questioned why their savings weren't growing despite her steady income, he deflected with jokes or sudden affection. Over time, she stopped asking. She told herself he was just stressed or forgetful. But now, everything snapped into focus. Greg hadn't just drifted. He'd been planning. And she had been too trusting. 6 months before the call, Madeline had made a quiet but important move. While refinancing to secure a better rate, she'd asked Harper, her longtime attorney and friend, to switch the deed into her name alone. Greg signed the paperwork without reading a word. "Whatever you think's best," he said. That moment replayed now like a twisted memory. He thought she'd handed him the keys to her life, but all along, she'd been protecting it. The loft wasn't just a property. It was a symbol of everything she'd built. And Greg had tried to steal it with a single, arrogant phone call. He truly had no idea who he was up against. Madeline didn't waste a second. As soon as her panel ended, she ducked into a quiet corner of the conference center and called Harper Lane. Harper, both her lawyer and closest confidant, picked up immediately. "Tell me you're joking," she said after hearing the news. "He actually tried to sell the loft?" Madeline nodded, voice calm but tight. "He thinks it's done. Thinks I'm going to be locked out." Harper let out a dry laugh. "Then, he's dumber than I thought. The sale's void. He can't sell what he doesn't own." Madeline closed her eyes and exhaled. That was all she needed to hear. Together they went over next steps like a battle plan. Harper would notify the buyer immediately and provide documentation showing Madeline's sole ownership. The transfer Greg attempted was not only illegal, it bordered on fraud. "If he's accepted money, he's in serious trouble," Harper added. "We're talking civil liability, maybe even criminal, if the buyer pushes it." Madeline felt a slow-burning satisfaction rise inside her. The man who once mocked her for overthinking everything was about to learn the cost of his own negligence. By the time she returned to her hotel that evening, Madeline's fear had been replaced by resolve. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to chase closure. Greg had declared war with that call, and now he'd get exactly what he deserved, served cold, legally and with receipts. She stared out at the city skyline from her window, phone still in hand, and texted Harper 2 words: "Make it hurt." Greg had thought she was the kind of woman who'd quietly disappear, but what he didn't realize was that behind Madeline's elegance was steel. And he had just handed her the legal sword. The moment Madeline stepped into her Portland loft, the air felt different, heavier, colder, tainted. Greg's things were still scattered around like nothing had changed, his jacket draped over the bar stool, his sneakers kicked off near the door. But the silence was deceptive. This was no longer his home. She placed her luggage down gently and walked through the space like a soldier returning to a battlefield. Every corner whispered betrayal, yet her presence reclaimed it. The real confrontation, she knew, wasn't over. It was just beginning. That evening, as predicted, Greg stormed in. The door slammed against the wall. He was clutching the formal letter Harper had sent. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, waving the paper like a white flag on fire. "You're saying I can't sell the loft? It's half mine." Madeline stayed seated, arms crossed, calm. "No, Greg. It hasn't been yours for 6 months. You signed it over when we refinanced." He blinked, confused. "That was just to lower the rate. That was to transfer ownership," she cut in, standing now. "Which you never read." Greg's anger twisted into disbelief. "You tricked me," he accused, pacing the living room. "This doesn't change anything. I already made the deal." Madeline didn't flinch. "That deal is void. The buyer's backing out, and if you've touched any of that deposit money, you've committed fraud." His jaw clenched, his bravado cracked. "You're bluffing." She reached into her file folder and held up the deed. "Try me." Greg's face drained of color. Suddenly the loft didn't feel so safe for him anymore. For the first time, Madeline saw something she hadn't expected. Fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing her, but fear of losing control. "You've always underestimated me," she said, voice low. "That ends today." She turned her back on him and walked into the kitchen, the sound of her heels sharp against the wood floor. Behind her, Greg stood frozen in the mess he made, finally realizing he was no longer the one in charge. The next morning, Madeline was sipping her coffee at the kitchen table when the front door creaked open. She didn't even have to turn around, she heard the giggle first. "Babe, this place is cuter than you described," a woman's voice chimed. Renee. The audacity struck like a second slap. Madeline stood slowly, setting her mug down with precision. When she turned, there they were, Greg looking smug, Renee clinging to his arm, scanning the loft like it was a boutique. "So, this is where we're staying?" Renee beamed. Madeline's expression hardened. "No, this is where Greg was staying." Renee's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice sharpening. Greg shifted uncomfortably, but Madeline stepped forward, unwavering. "This is my home. The deed is in my name. Greg tried to sell it behind my back. That sale was invalid and illegal." She paused. "Which means you're trespassing." The air shifted. Renee blinked fast, then turned to Greg. "You said this was your place, that you sold it," he stammered. I'm working on it. It's complicated." "No, it's not," Madeline said. "He lied. To you, to the buyer, and tried to steal from me." Renee's posture changed. Her hand dropped from Greg's arm, her voice suddenly cold. "So, there's no money? No move-in? Nothing?" Greg reached for her, but she pulled away. "Are you serious right now?" she hissed. Madeline stepped back, giving them space to implode. "You two should finish this outside," she said flatly. Renee grabbed her purse without another word and walked out, heels echoing down the hall. Greg stood there, stunned and sputtering. Madeline picked up her coffee, took a sip, and nodded toward the door. "You should go too, before you lose the last ounce of dignity you're pretending to have." After Renee stormed out, Greg lingered in the doorway, his usual confidence unraveling. "Come on, Maddie. This is getting out of hand," he said, voice softening like it still had sway. But Madeline didn't flinch. "Out of hand?" she echoed. "You tried to erase me with a signature and a girlfriend? Now you're surprised there are consequences?" His eyes darted around the room, as if seeing it for the first time through someone else's ownership. The framed art, the rug she hand-picked, the shelves she'd built. None of it belonged to him anymore. And now, he knew it. Over the next 2 days, Greg transformed from cocky to desperate. He called non-stop, leaving voicemails that swung from begging to bitterness. "You don't have to do this," one said. "We can fix it." Another, "You'll ruin me, Maddie. Is that what you want?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Harper handled everything behind the scenes, ensuring the voided sale documentation reached the right hands. The buyer, furious at being misled, threatened Greg with legal action. His brokerage firm began internal review. The walls were closing in. Madeline stayed focused. She moved Greg's belongings into boxes, one by one. Methodical, surgical. She stacked them neatly in the corner, labeled with blue painter's tape. When Nina stopped by, she raised an eyebrow. "You're giving him too much grace," she said, tossing one of his cufflinks into a box with theatrical flair. Madeline shrugged. "Let him see how carefully I packed the life he tried to steal." Every folded shirt, every removed photo frame was another stitch in her emotional recovery. Greg may have tried to bury her, but now he was the one sinking. And Madeline? She was finally rising. The loft felt different once Greg's things were gone, lighter, warmer, finally hers again. Madeline opened the windows wide, letting in the crisp Portland air as if to cleanse the space. She played her favorite jazz records, something Greg had always rolled his eyes at, and rearranged the living room furniture without asking anyone's opinion. With Nina's help, she hung a bold, abstract painting in the entryway, a piece Greg once called chaotic. Now, it felt like a declaration. This wasn't just redecorating, it was reclamation. They laughed as they worked, sipping wine and dragging out dusty boxes from the closet. "This place feels alive again," Nina said, fluffing a pillow on the couch. Madeline nodded. "Because it's finally honest," she replied. Every small change made the loft reflect her, the woman who'd fought to keep it, who stood her ground. She ordered new curtains, added cozy throws, and even put up fairy lights along the balcony railing. Little details, each one a rebellion against who she had been with Greg. Careful, quiet, accommodating. Harper called the next morning with good news. The buyer had officially withdrawn, and the divorce petition was in motion. "You're in a strong position," she said. "He's got no leverage." Madeline smiled as she ended the call, glancing around her refreshed space. The loft was no longer a battlefield. It had become her sanctuary, one she had defended and reshaped on her own terms. The betrayal still echoed in certain corners, but with every framed photo of her travels, every new plant on the windowsill, those echoes faded. Madeline wasn't rebuilding from scratch. She was evolving, right where it all began. The fallout came quickly. Within a week, Greg's world began to crack. The buyer he misled wasn't just angry, they were connected, and they knew how to make noise. His brokerage firm caught wind of the fraudulent deal and launched a formal investigation. Harper forwarded Madeline a copy of the buyer's complaint. "Intentional misrepresentation," it read. Greg had tried to play real estate cowboy, but instead, he'd walked straight into legal quicksand. His charm, once his greatest weapon, had finally expired. The voicemails kept coming, each one more pitiful than the last. "You don't have to ruin me," he pleaded in one. "We were good once, weren't we?" In another, he blamed Renee. "She pushed me. I got caught up." Madeline didn't bother replying. She had nothing left to say. She saved the recordings in a folder named Closure and forwarded anything useful to Harper. There was no satisfaction in his desperation, just confirmation that she'd been right to walk away. Friends began reaching out, whispering about Greg's downfall. He'd been pulled from major listings. Rumors circulated that his license might be suspended. Renee, from what Madeline heard, had already cut ties and moved out. "Guess she didn't sign up for lawsuits," Nina said with a smirk. Madeline sipped her tea, unmoved. Greg had built his empire on lies and ego, and now it was crumbling brick by brick. She didn't celebrate his collapse, but she didn't mourn it either. He hadn't just tried to sell a loft. He'd tried to sell her short, and in doing so, he'd lost everything, including the one person who might have once fought for him. While reorganizing the last drawer of the sideboard, Madeline stumbled upon a photo tucked inside a forgotten folder. Her and Greg, arms wrapped around each other at the loft's balcony, taken just weeks after they'd moved in. They were smiling, young and hopeful. For a moment, the image tugged at something deep, not because she missed him, but because she mourned who she had been in that photo. A woman full of trust, a woman who thought love meant sacrificing her voice to keep the peace. She ran her fingers along the frame, then slowly slid it into an envelope and tucked it away in a storage bin labeled Past. She wasn't ready to throw it away, not out of longing, but because it didn't deserve a dramatic end. It was just a relic now. That version of Madeline no longer lived here. The walls had heard enough apologies, enough silence. Now, the loft echoed with the sound of jazz, laughter, and fresh starts. She lit a sandalwood candle, curled up on the sofa with her journal, and finally allowed herself a moment of stillness. There were no more schemes to dismantle, no more lies to uncover, only space to breathe and grow. The ghost of Greg would fade, not with a bang, but with a whisper. And Madeline? She had already stepped into the light, one quiet, courageous decision at a time. Madeline stood on the balcony one evening, wrapped in a soft throw, a cup of tea warming her hands. Below, Portland's city lights flickered like tiny affirmations, each one reflecting the choices that led her here. The loft had once symbolized a shared dream, a future built together, but now it stood for something far more powerful. The life she reclaimed, not through revenge, but through resilience. Greg's betrayal hadn't destroyed her, it had revealed her. All along, she'd been the one holding everything together, not just the home, but the love, the effort, the grace. She didn't need validation, or closure, or even an apology. She had peace. The loft, now filled with bold colors, scented candles, and sunlight, was no longer a memory of what was lost, but a testament to what she'd found within herself. She'd learned that silence isn't strength, and love shouldn't cost your voice. Most importantly, she realized she didn't need to start over somewhere new to find freedom. She just needed to take back the space that had always been hers. As she looked out over the city, she smiled. Not because it was over, but because she knew now how to begin. The story of Madeline Brooks is a powerful reminder that strength isn't always loud, it's often quiet, deliberate, and rooted in self-respect. Madeline didn't seek revenge through chaos or confrontation. Instead, she chose clarity, legality, and grace. When betrayal shattered the life she thought she'd built with Greg, she didn't fall apart. She stepped back, recalibrated, and used her foresight to protect what mattered most: herself. The true lesson lies in how she reclaimed not only her home, but her identity. She learned that love without respect is manipulation, and silence in a relationship often masks survival, not harmony. By refusing to play the victim and standing firmly in her truth, she transformed pain into power. The loft became more than real estate. It was the stage for her awakening. In the end, Madeline's journey teaches us that we don't always need to run from the ruins of a broken relationship. Sometimes, the greatest form of healing is to stay right where you are, clear the wreckage, and rebuild, stronger, smarter, and entirely on your own terms. Freedom doesn't come from escape. It comes from standing still and saying, "This is mine, I'm not leaving, and I'm not breaking."